All right, it's hard to believe I believe. It's hard to believe I believe. How about that? It's hard to believe. I think we are in lesson 10 on the book of Judges, and we still got a long ways to go. So we are on Judges chapter 7 tonight. And the theme of the book of Judges is man's rebellion and God's mercy. And this is part 2 on Gideon. So let's do a recap here. We first were introduced to Gideon last week in chapter 6, if you remember. And we observed Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press, hiding from the Midianites who were raiding Manasseh. That's the tribe that Gideon is from. The angel of the Lord greets Gideon with a startling greeting, namely that Gideon is a valiant warrior. You and I recall that Gideon argues with the angel that if God was with Israel, why are all of these things happening? He asks, where are the miracles he has heard his fathers and grandfathers tell him about God? Now, the angel of the Lord never answers the why question. There's a principle there for us by application. I have not found many examples in the Bible where man has asked God a why question and he answered. We have a tendency to ask why among ourselves, and God can ask us why. But when we ask God why, I do not know of a biblical example where he responds to us. I think probably one of the reasons is that we would not like his answer. Now, the angel commissions Gideon for military service. Gideon will deliver Manasseh from the hand of the Midianites. Gideon wonders if this angel is really a heavenly being, so he requests the angel to remain while he prepares a meal, which is a Jewish custom of honor. And the angel remains behind. And the angel instructs Gideon to arrange the meal as a sacrifice. And then the angel puts the tip of his staff on the offering and it is consumed. And Gideon is so overwhelmed with this, he builds an altar and names that place Jehovah Shalom, or the Lord is peace. Now, Gideon receives his first assignment. I'm recapping chapter 6 here, namely to tear down the altar of Baal. And we were somebody needs to turn their mic off. And we discovered that Gideon's father evidently was the townskeeper for the idol. And Gideon is fearful of his father and the men of the community. Now, when Gideon does this and tears down Baal, his name is changed to Jerubbaal, the man who contends with Baal. And he's given a new task of delivering Manasseh, but his faith is weak, so he tests the Lord with the fleece. Let's get into chapter 7 now. The army of Israel gathers together. Verse 1 through 3. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and camped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill country of Morah in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into your hands, for Israel would become boastful, saying, my own power has delivered me. Now therefore, come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. So 22,000 people returned, but 10,000 remained. So Gideon called together 32,000 men of war, primarily from the tribes of Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali that we discovered in chapter 6, verse 35. Now, it's going to be interesting that he's going against the Midianites, which had a 4-to-1 ratio as far as soldiers were concerned. Now, I mentioned about who comprises the army. That is Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, along with Manasseh. And they are all within the same general area. Now, according to verse 3, there's 30,000. Now, the Midianites, according to chapter 8, verse 10, were 135,000 strong. You do the math. The ratio is about 4.5 to 1. Now, verse 2 records God's perspective on this massive army and why he instructs Gideon to downsize. Gideon and the soldiers would become prideful, thinking it was their hand that accomplished the victory. God tells Gideon to tell the soldiers that if any were afraid and trembling, to go home. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, based on the Hebrew as well, if any are afraid, mental fear, questioning whether they should be there, whether they're going to have victory, what's going on. And then the trembling, the physical manifestation of the mental anguish. And I think this is reasonable because even in our own lives, when we are fearful, it'll come out physiologically. There will be signs that we are upset, that we are concerned about something. Now, this is a standard practice for Israel when they went out to battle. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8. Let me read those verses to you. And this is under chapter 20 about the laws of warfare. And this is where we also come to understand what to do in besieging cities outside of the land and what to do with the cities inside the land. And in verse 8 it says, "Then the officers shall speak further to the people and say, who is the man that is afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's hearts melt like his." Fear, beloved, can be contagious. It can infect other people or affect other people. So the scriptures tell us in verse 3 that 22,000 went home. That leaves 10,000. And that is still too many, because now we come to the second reduction phase, verses 3 through 8. Now, therefore come, verse 3, they were reduced to 10,000. Verse 4, then the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. It's interesting, God did not leave the choice up to Gideon about which one should stay, which one should go, how many should stay, how many should go. God says, look, I'll show you how many people are going to battle with you against the Midianites. I'll test them. He continues in verse 4, therefore it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you, but every one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So God had a standard for evaluating which men would go to battle and which men would go home. As I said, it's not going to be left up to Gideon's intuition, friendship, anything like that. And Gideon was to listen to the Lord. It says specifically, verse 4, God says, I'll tell you. Verse 5, so he brought the people down to the water, Gideon did. And the Lord said to Gideon, you shall separate everyone who laps the water with, let's get my pages right. You shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men, but all the rest of the people kneeled down to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with the 300 men who lap and will give the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each man to his house. So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets into their hands. And Gideon sent all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below them in the valley. So get a mental picture here. Gideon's elevated somewhat above the Midianites. Now let me give you some observations here. Verse 4, as I said earlier, the Lord will test the remaining 10,000. This test will reveal to Gideon which men will go to battle. And the test involved drinking water. Whoever kneels down to drink water was disqualified. Whoever brought the water to his mouth will go into battle. What's the significance? It is not clearly stated, but we might draw the following conclusion. To kneel down to drink, meaning they put their face near or into the water, meant that they would be distracted, lose concentration to their surroundings. They would become an easy target for ambush because their face is in the water or close to the water. The ones who cup their hands, drawing water up to their mouth, would maintain an alertness and vigilance to their surroundings. And there were 300 men who did that. This is what God was looking for. The men who would be alert and astute to their surroundings, especially as they go into battle, and especially with the military strategy that the Lord was going to give Gideon, because now the odds of the Midianites, which are 135,000 to 300, the odds are overwhelmingly against Israel. So the victory had to come from the Lord. No Israelite would be able to say, look what we have done. Because in their weakness, God is strong. I think that's a New Testament principle as well. This is the visual picture, some artists, and you can see some people bringing water up to their mouth. Other people have their face down into the water. And in this pictorial, artistic drawing, you see Gideon in the background. And the Lord is telling him which ones to select. Now, God sees Gideon's fear in verses 9 to 15. Permit me to read those verses. Now, the same night it came about that the Lord said to Gideon, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. Now, if somebody can do the math real quick and let me know what the ratio is of 135,000 to 300, and then just cue in here and tell us what the ratio is. That is a overwhelming situation. Now, compound that problem with darkness. God's military strategy is unlike what you read about in Joshua. They went against Jericho during the day. They went against Ai during the day. I believe this is the first nighttime military attack that Israel would be involved with. So besides the overwhelming odds against them, now they have the darkness to contend with. They probably knew the terrain, but still, the darkness and the number of people. And God says, verse 10, but if you are afraid to go down, if you're not ready to go to battle now, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp, and you will hear what they say. And afterwards, your hands will be strengthened that you may go down against the camp. So he went with Purah, his servant, down to the outposts of the army that was in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Man, this had to be better than Woodstock. I mean, tremendous amount of people and animals. Verse 13, when Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. And he said, behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian. And I came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. His friend replied, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon and the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand. When Midian heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into our hands. Let me give you some observation. The Lord once again tells Gideon to go and attack the Midianites. As I mentioned, it is nighttime, but this is God's strategy. But it seems that because it is nighttime, God recognized Gideon is still fearful. Now, Gideon has this streak of fear in his life. He has been dominated by fear. How do we know that? Well, where was he threshing wheat at? In a wine press. Why didn't he go take the altar of Baal down during the daytime? He feared his father and the community. And now, I believe he can see the massive hordes of Midianites and Amalekites because he's elevated higher than them. And perhaps like Joshua, he's wondering how in the world are we going to go ahead and have victory? God says we're going to have victory, but I certainly don't know how we're going to do that. So God, once again, seeks to alleviate Gideon's fear by telling him to take a personal servant, Purah, and head down to the Midianite camp. Now, Purah, his name means branch or fruitful. In regard to a human relationship, it means loyal, faithful, someone who has your back, someone who has your interests at heart. Some suggest that Purah was Gideon's armor bearer or closest personal servant. Now, what I find interesting, you've got to close your eyes and get a mental picture here. They slipped down to the edge of the Midian camp. How could they get so close without being detected? Is only because of the hand of God. They got close enough to hear the voices. Now, these soldiers are not shouting back and forth. Their fellow soldiers would have yelled at them and told them to shut up. They are close enough to be talking at a low tone between them. And Gideon gets so close, unless the Lord really super intensified his hearing, he got so close, unobserved, that he heard the conversation between two soldiers. What did he hear? One soldier was relating a dream that he had about a loaf of barley rolling down a hill and crushing the tents. Now, in Hebrew literature, there is a lot of symbolism that is associated with dreams. Before I tell you what that means, if you have a chance, look at the map and notice where the Midian army is. They're in a low-lying ravine or valley, and Gideon is above that position. Now, the friend hearing the story provides the interpretation by stating that the loaf of barley bread is Gideon crushing them. Okay, Gideon has been called a man of valor. Now he's being called a loaf of bread. Now, it's interesting that they themselves attribute the victory to God of Israel, because Gideon is a man of Israel. And the name they use in Hebrew is Elohim. However, that is a common name for pagan deities and gods. But to the Hebrew, Elohim means one who is supreme or mighty. They also know that this Gideon was the one that took down Baal in town. They had to know this. Now, what in the world is going on? What's the bread, this loaf of barley? Barley represented the basic staple of poor people. And the Midianites and the Amalekites, when they raided the land, took the animals and the crops and everything, the only thing left for the Israelites were a little bit of wheat and barley harvest. And this foreign army would understand that. They would know that. And so here comes this loaf of barley bread rolling down a hill. Ah, that's Gideon. And he's crushing the tents of the Midianites and the Amalekites. So what does Gideon do? Well, first of all, he worships. How often does God do something miraculous for us and we run off and enjoy the miracle and not worship? Gideon prostrated himself and worshiped God. Now, he races to the camp. It's still nighttime. He tells the 300 soldiers, "Get up, we're going into battle." And you can see a surge of confidence overtake Gideon. He is just all jacked up and ready to go. God has met his fear. Isn't that so gracious of God to meet our fear, which when he does should energize us, should motivate us to take the next step in obedience to the plan he has for our lives. Well, let's take a look at the military strategy in verses 16 to 22. I find this strategy strange. I don't think any of our U.S. military generals would try to employ this. Beginning in verse 16. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies. So what does that mean? There's 3 companies of 100 each men. And he put trumpets and empty pitchers into their hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. You got the visual here? In one hand, they got the trumpet. In the other hand, they have a pitcher with a torch inside of it. Now, the reason the torch is inside the pitcher is to conceal the light. Remember, it's nighttime. It's dark. They don't want to be revealed until God tells Gideon to do what he wants the soldiers to do. And that's very, very important. I guess the question I have that I cannot answer, and Scripture doesn't answer, did Gideon have any inkling whatsoever that this was the strategy that God would have him do? Because the question I have is, where in the world did they get 300 pitchers? Where? Was Walmart open? Was there a 24/7 Walmart there? I think maybe Gideon might have known what the strategy was, because when all of the other people left, it said, as we read earlier, that the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets in their hand. So what's God's military strategy here? We continue in verse 17. He tells these people, look at me and do likewise. When you are in leadership, beloved, we should be able to tell people, look at me and do what I do. The Apostle Paul put it in similar fashion. Be imitators of Christ as you see me imitating Christ. Our world is so prone and our culture is so prone, do as I say, don't do as I do. Well, that's unbiblical. And he says now in verse 17, and behold, when I come to the outskirts of camp, do as I do. So where are these three groups of 100 men stationed? On the outskirts of the Midian and Amalekites' camp. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, so Gideon had a bunch of men with him, then you also blow the trumpets all around the camp and say, for the Lord and for Gideon. Now, Joshua didn't say for the Lord and for Joshua. And I'm not quite sure why Gideon added his name to the situation. Maybe to give validity that he was the one that took down Baal. I'm not quite sure. Verse 19, so Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just posted the watch. So they're coming at night, and they're catching them at the change of shift of the sentinels. And they blew the trumpets, smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. When the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing and crying, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Verse 21, each stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran, crying out as they fled. And when they blew 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army. That's the Midianites and the Amalekites now. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah toward Zeriah, as far as the edge of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. Can you picture this now? Let me show you a visual. There's Gideon. Got the trumpet in one hand, he got the torches inside the pitcher in the other. And he said, look, you do what I do. So Gideon has 100 men, and the other 200 are circling the camp. They're on the outskirts. And if you listen to the scripture very carefully, it said that they stayed in their position. They didn't rush the camp. That would have been a suicide mission. Remember the odds, okay? Would have been a suicide position and mission for them. So Gideon set the example. Blowing the trumpet would be a tremendous loud noise. 300 trumpets blowing in the dead of night, down in a valley where the sound would carry an echo. It would sound like more than 300 men blowing the trumpet. Let me draw a correlation here. Many times Jesus taught from a boat offshore. I think there were two reasons for that. One, the crowds were so large. And second of all, it was a natural amplification of sound. Water is a tremendous carrier of sound. And so just imagine 300 pitchers crashing. Imagine the trumpets blowing, the noise and the confusion. It says that very carefully in verse 22. They were confused about what was going on. Verse 21 and 22, they were running all over the place. And then, look at this, then a ring of fire. surrounded the camp. This is all the torches that were surrounding the edge of the camp. And it looked like there were more soldiers than 300 because of the illumination. And the noise has created such fear and confusion in these soldiers, they didn't know who the enemy were, and they killed each other. And the ones who survived fled and ran away. But they stayed in their positions. No one moved. Each remained in the stationed position. And the noise and the visual effect confused these seasoned soldiers, that they started attacking each other because they were unable to distinguish a friendly from an enemy. And so they fled. God kept his promises. Verse 23 to 25. The men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh. It's interesting. They started out with 30,000, wound up with 3. So the 27,000 men who went back home from these tribes were summoned to come down and participate in the victory. They were as much a part of the victory as the 300 that actually did the immediate attack, because this 30,000 strong now are going to go ahead and pursue the Midianites and the Amalekites. Gideon, verse 26, sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim. My goodness, we've seen Ephraim before with Deborah, saying, come down against Midian and take the waters before them as far as Beth-hara and the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took the waters as far as Beth-hara and the Jordan. Now, if you take a look at your inheritance map, you will see these are a closely knit group of tribes. And Gideon is being governed by God, I believe, and understanding that if they cross the river and get to the other side, they will lose. And so they call Ephraim down and say, look, guard the waters. Don't let them get by. The men who left and were sent home were summoned. If you examine a map, you'll see the extent of the Midian and the Amalekite presence in the tribes of Israel that they oppressed. Now, I'm sure each of these tribes were more than willing now to act, seeing that the Lord initiated the victory. What are some life lessons that we can learn from here? Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says, these have been written for our example, that we would not crave like they did, crave evil things like they did. So there are lessons from the Old Testament. It is not just historical facts. First, Proverbs 19:21. It says this, many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord stands. I don't know whether Gideon had a plan in his mind on how to go ahead and do that. I guess if he had the 30,000, he might have had a plan. But again, God says, no, you know what? Your plan is going to create pride if I go ahead of you and give you victory. We're going to whittle this down. We're going to whittle this down. In Proverbs 16:9, a similar verse, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And that's important for us to understand. James chapter 5 talks to these dispersed Christians and say, look, you say that on such and such a day we're going to do such and such. And James warns them, be careful about your planning, because the Lord has to be in charge. Commit your ways to the Lord, Proverbs 3:5 and 6, and he will direct your paths. Now, the plans of the Lord may seem foolish. difficult to understand from our point of view, but he provides encouragement for us to be faithful in executing his will for his glory. Stop and think about some of the battles in the book of Joshua, especially the Battle of Jericho. My goodness, that was outstanding, to march around that city and then simply to shout and blow the horns. What a military strategy. Paul put it this way: when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul says he uses the simple to confound the wise. So when we discern what the will of God is and how he wants us to execute his will, because it will be for his glory, so we can echo the words of the Apostle Paul: I don't boast in anything of myself, only in the Lord. But he will give us encouragement to a plan according to our mind that seems really foolish and hard to understand. He will encourage us. Didn't he do that with Gideon? He will do that with us. And that encouragement, listen to me, should give us the gumption to execute his will, because he's relying on us to execute his will according to his plan. Now, there's nothing wrong with planning, beloved. Nothing wrong with planning. If you don't plan, I think we're being foolish. If you don't have a plan, you're never going to accomplish very much. There may be several options to a plan, but we must seek the Lord's counsel to know which option he wants us to use. So here you have a situation, whatever it might be, and you have consulted the scriptures to make sure you've listed down the options, and you have 3 options there, and you have consulted the scriptures, and none of those options are unbiblical. You can act on any one of those options, and you will not disobey the Lord. So what do I do then? Am I left up to my own understanding which option to choose? Well, that would be in violation of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, right? So how do we determine? Well, you take a look at the options and say, which one brings God the most glory? You take a look at your options. Which one would demonstrate I am humble and a servant of the Lord? Which one will communicate clearly the battle is the Lord and not mine? I think there are some very important questions we can ask ourselves about the options, because I believe that if we are faced with several options and all of them are okay, all of them would be okay. We're not disobeying the Lord. We're not going to dishonor him. But I think there's a human tendency in us that we will choose the option that is the easiest to do and choose the option that will present the least resistance, because we are lazy people. We don't want the difficult pathway in front of us. You know what comes to my mind? What comes to my mind is the Lord and his conversation with Isaiah. And God says, Isaiah, I'm going to send you. And Isaiah says, okay, I'll go. Who will go for me? Isaiah, oh, here I am. I'm volunteering. And then Isaiah asks some very logical questions. How long will I preach, and how many are going to come back to you? Here's the Lord's encouragement, okay? Fasten your seatbelt. No one's going to return to me because of your preaching, and you're going to do it the rest of your life. Oh, whoa, time out. Come on. Oh. I think I want to withdraw my voluntary application. Hey, that's how it goes sometimes. And then finally, one here, you might think this is odd, but I think it is valid. Sometimes the smaller the number involved in performing God's will enhances unity and strength. The smaller the number involved in performing God's will, in doing God's will, executing God's will, I think builds unity and strength. It enhances unity and strength. May I suggest to you why? When you reduce the numbers, you eliminate conflict because of personal preferences. Shrink the numbers down to a common heart agreement. And I think that's why Gideon was told to take Purah with him down to here. Because Gideon could have gone down there and could have heard this whole vision and the interpretation and come back, and like the 10 spies at Kadesh Barnea, I don't know, they're talking about some loaf of barley bread coming down and crashing into the tents. I just don't understand that. But with Purah there, Purah could confirm what God had said. Purah could encourage Gideon. You know what this is called, beloved? It's called a John Mark Barnabas relationship. You know what this is called, beloved? A Paul and Timothy relationship. You know what this is called, beloved? An older man discipling and teaching a younger man. You know what this is called, beloved? An older woman teaching a younger woman. And beloved, when there is, listen to me, when there is unity and strength, you will see it summarized in the book of Acts. They had one mind and one heart. And they did great things for God because there was no dissension between them. You see the dissension, beloved, take place in Acts chapter 6, I believe it is, or Acts 4, with Barnabas and the jealousy by Ananias and Sapphira. There's a conflict between Paul and Barnabas in Acts 14 and 15 about going back out and visiting, but that was a personal perspective on John Mark. Paul threw John Mark under the bus. John Mark didn't react to persecution like I did. John Mark wasn't stoned like I was. He's not missionary material. He can go home. Barnabas says, you know what? Paul, you're out of line. And they separated. And what happened? Barnabas took that young, fearful man under his wing and grew him and trained him, that at the near the end of Paul's life, you know what he said? Bring John Mark to me, for he's profitable in the ministry. You know what, the Apostle Paul, you can't take credit for that. You can take credit for the 1623 people in Romans chapter 16 that you disciple, but you cannot take credit for John Mark because you did not do it. Barnabas did. Small numbers can accomplish great things because it enhances unity and strength. Thoughts or questions that you might have? I hesitate to even ask that. All right, anybody want to share anything?
I have one question, Dr. Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Miss Davis.
When you gave the we are to plan, we should have options, and you said consult the scriptures, and you had given 3 things we should consider. I was only able to capture the first one. Choose the one where God gets the most glory, and then you gave 2 more. I
Okay.
missed those.
I ad-libbed, but let me see if I can remember what I ad-libbed, okay? The second
It
one,
was.
go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The second one was, somebody help me out. Karis, Carl?
You were saying something like where he did it and you didn't do it. I'm just putting it in my own words.
Okay, well, that would be number 3. Number 2, I believe, was which plan would demonstrate humility.
Okay.
Okay. The third one would be which plan would demonstrate that I'm a servant and allowing the Lord to accomplish what He wants to accomplish. You know,
Okay.
sometimes I add. Jody, what?
Okay.
Would it be demonstrating obedience?
Thank you very kindly.
Mm-hmm.
My personal assistant takes great notes.
Amen. Thank you. Both.
All right. Does anybody have any thoughts? Now, I did not show you the last slide. Next Sunday, which is Easter Sunday, we're still going to meet unless you all are going to be, you know, picking out on French vanilla silk caramel chocolate chip pie, okay? We're still going to meet Easter night, 7 o'clock. Judges 8. Gideon's failure. Gideon's failure. See if you can identify what tripped him up. What tripped him up? Because he led Israel back down a dark path. Tuesday, the parable of the sower and the seed. Probably a very familiar parable with you, for you. I'm going to try to put on some different glasses in looking at this. This is one of the parables that Jesus explains. Thursday, we'll be back to criticism on trial as we continue to work through the New Testament. Sunday, 5 reasons why the most powerful word in the Bible is the word resurrection. There's a lot of powerful words in the Bible, but I believe resurrection is the most powerful word in the Bible. It has some tremendous reasons why that I will offer on Sunday. So Friday, I will post the Good Friday service, but you'll get an email letting you know that it's been posted. And if you want to, you can go look at that on your own. And then every day I'm doing a daily devotion on 2 Corinthians 7, 9, 10, and 11, sorrow over my sin. And Monday we're going to be talking about the 2 types of sorrow. Basically, I want to go back and look at the word regret. Sorrow without regret. That's an important word. And then we'll talk a little bit about worldly sorrow. And then probably for the rest of the week, we'll camp in on the description of godly sorrow in verse 11. If there's no other thoughts, I am going to go eat my vanilla fudge melted ice cream.
Enjoy.
I'm so jealous.
Oh, I plan to.
Did you finally turn up the heat?
Say what?
Did you finally turn up the heat or something?
No, I've left it out all afternoon long.
Oh, yeah.
You know, if that doesn't work, I put it in the microwave for about 15, 20 seconds.
Yeah.
That's what Gary does.
Yeah. Hey, Gary is in good company. Tell him that, Jeanette, when it comes down to ice cream, okay? All right, nobody has any other thoughts or questions, comments?
No.
If I may.
Sherry, you got a question?
No, I'm sorry. I'm speaking to my husband.
Oh. Jody,
Yeah,
do I see any smoke coming up?
Nope, not tonight. I thought it was very clear.
Oh, wow. I got to work on that. You guys have a
I
great
had my big listeners on.
All right. You guys have a good night, and